last segment we talked about how the Ba'ath Party was able to take control of Iraq, and we also mentioned Saddam getting his start back in 1963. I also called him an assassin. I should have elaborated that one of the ways he got rid of his rivals was to just kill him. And he actually served as an assassin for the party until he became one of its key leaders. So that's why the reference to Saddam being an assassin. So we mentioned also that by 1968, the Tikrit faction, Tikrit being the village of Saddam, had prevailed, and so now it becomes a Tikriti affair. And what happens next, we need to go to 1974, and what happens in that period is what we call a Kurdish episode. I had really mentioned this episode in an earlier lecture, but it's worth briefly summarizing it here because we learned about this episode through the Pike Committee in the House of Representatives, who was investigating illegal CIA activities. The committee's report was later leaked to the Village Voice magazine by a former CBS correspondent, Daniel Schorr. He was a great correspondent, not just for leaking, but he was just a very honorable, very ethical correspondent. Unfortunately, he lost his job at CBS, but fortunately, he was hired by NPR. Now, the harebrained scheme regarding this 1974 Kurdish episode involved a plot that was hatched by the Shah of Iran, Henry Kissinger of the United States, and of course Israel. The idea was to use the Kurds as a pawn to destabilize Iraq and also to sabotage Iraq's close relationship with its mentor, the Soviet Union. So the way the plot was supposed to work was as follows. Israel was to give captured Soviet arms, which they had obtained during their prior wars with the Arabs, was to give these arms to Iran. Iran, in turn, would give these arms to the Kurds, making it thus appear as if the Soviet Union, Iraq's ally and mentor, is arming the Kurds in Kurdish insurrection against their own client. In other words, the Soviets were betraying Saddam. So the Kurds get the arms, they're up against the Iraqis, they're up in arms and they're fighting them. And of course, when the Iraqis capture the weapons, they realize it's a Soviet weapons, but the Iraqis were not fooled. They understood what was happening. And so therefore, the whole scheme didn't work except at the detriment of the Kurds who were used as pawns. Now, given the kind of a provocation that had taken place against the Soviet Union, what was the Soviet reaction to this provocation? Again, as my usual answer in these cases, you've gotten accustomed to, the Soviets did absolutely nothing. Remember now, the Kurds are an ethnic group that were already represented in the former Soviet Union. So in the area of Azerbaijan, there were already Kurds there, but the Soviets didn't do anything. Now the reason I mention this, excuse me, it's because the Soviet passivity finally convinced Saddam that they are really not a very reliable ally. So this becomes ingrained in Saddam's thinking that you can't count always on the Soviet Union. So Saddam ends up working out an agreement with Iran in 1975, and basically he works out the differences with the Shah of Iran over a disputed river, Shatt al-Arab, regarding where the border is, and this agreement culminates in the Algiers formal agreement with Iran, in which Iran and Iraq settled their dispute over the river border. The Kurds were now being sold out again. The Shah promises not to arm the Kurd, and without the Shah's arming the Kurd, Saddam goes and defeats them, and defeats the insurrection. Now, reaching an agreement with Iran was itself indicative of Saddam's decision to move closer to the region's conservative pro-West regimes in the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and also Iran. He simply had realized that he could not count on Soviet support. So in 1975, Saddam still is not a president of Iraq, but he is really the power. By 1978, however, Saddam becomes the president of Iraq. As I mentioned, long before he became the president, Saddam had already been the eminent gray, the real power behind the scene of the then president Hassan al-Bakr. The new regime under Saddam has a very powerful control system, and I want to discuss that briefly. Going back to our model of control system that I had discussed throughout the course, if you look at Saddam's control circa 1980s, this is the way it would look. At the primary level, you have coercion. The main target of coercions are the Shiites, which are the majority of the Iraqis, and the Kurds. They're also they're about 20% of the population. So you're looking at a minority government, minority Sunni. And also those faction of the Ba'ath Party that is pro-Syrian. Remember, the Ba'ath Party was both in Syria and Iraq, and in each country they had a pro-Iraq or pro-Syria opposition faction. So those are the main groups that are being coerced. At the same time, Saddam has the oil money with which he can co-opt the population, and it seems to work. But any sign of dissent in that country will get brutally repressed. In fact, the brutality of the coercion was so high that after Pol Pot, our old ally in Cambodia, the most oppressive regime in the world was considered to be Saddam's regime. On the other hand, though, he does gain some popularity, some attraction, especially among the Sunnis, because he ends up improving Iraqis' material life thanks to the oil money. NH, normative habitual, when coercion is at the primary level and normative habitual is at the secondary level, if you recall, that simply suggests people accepting the regime. There is a sense of resignation on the part of the population because they realize that there isn't much they could do. It's easier to accept the regime if materially you're being rewarded. Finally, NA, normative active. In some ways, we have used that as a measure of nationalism, as a measure of political legitimacy. The legitimacy of Saddam was really higher than the Shah of Iran. After all, he was not put in power by the imperialists. He was an indigenous leader who got there through his own efforts by besting his rival. Oftentimes that meant simply eliminating them, but it was his doing rather than foreigners doing it. Therefore, he was not tainted as a foreign lackey the way the Shah of Iran was seen as being put on the throne by the CIA. In the meantime, what is happening, let me mention, going back, at the tertiary level, really I don't put anything there because there was nothing there, the NA was high. If you look at this is pretty good control system so long as the U continues. That is, the U is used to co-opt a large portion of the population that are willing to be acquiescent. Later on in the 1990s, after the invasion of Kuwait and defeat of Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, you will see that the U will decline because he is not able to sell as much oil. So the U comes down in the 1990s, but pretty much the rest of it stays the same. Now, moving on, I mentioned that as Saddam moves to become the president, the Ba'ath Party's survival increasingly becomes tied to Saddam's survivals and Saddam's political fortune. So the Ba'ath Party really by this time has become much more, or is in the process of becoming much more personality independent, its survival depending on Saddam. So the Ba'ath Party begins to be somewhat different. As opposed to being a personality independent party, is becoming a personality dependent party. Now, 1978, we do get a very big shock in the Arab world, and that is, as you can guess, the Camp David shock. That essentially involves Sadat of Egypt defecting from the Arab ranks and signing a separate peace deal with Israel. As I mentioned, you have to remember that we discussed this very much when we talked about Sadat and Egypt. But with Egypt being the most important and largest Arab country defecting, the Arabs were pretty much left on their own, and without Egypt, none of them was powerful enough to really challenge Israel. Therefore, the Arab felt vulnerable, and the sense of threat from the West and Israel on the part of the Arabs, the remaining Arabs, increased. So the immediacy of the perceived threat now drives Saddam to patch up things with Syria, and there is talk about possible union between the two. The following year, the world witnesses even a bigger shock. In 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution succeeding. So with the revolution overthrowing the Shah and replacing the 2,500-year-old monarchy with an Islamic republic, we have a very different Middle East. Now, what was Saddam's take on the Iranian Revolution, and how did that interpretation differ from Assad of Syria? So the question of interpreting the significance of Iran's revolution becomes a critical factor in terms of the kind of alliance you're going to see among Arabs and Iranians. And in this connection, contrasting Hafez al-Assad's interpretation of the significance of the revolution versus Saddam Hussein's is very instructive. Assad believed that the revolution was a God-sent gift to the Arabs to compensate them for the Camp David calamity. So therefore, as far as he was concerned, revolution had made Iran a major strategic ally of the Arabs. I should mention the first foreign visitor after the revolution to Iran was none other than the PLO leader Yasser Arafat. And one of the first things Iran did was to destroy the incognito Israeli embassy and, in other words, actually not destroy it, but turn it over to the Palestinian and make it an embassy for Palestine. The interpretation that Saddam had of the same phenomena, the revolution, was dramatically different. For Saddam, he believed that the overthrow of the Shah, remember, the Shah was the most important ally of the United States in the region. According to Saddam, that was not much of a significant strategic factor. It really didn't have, as far as he was concerned, or at least he verbalized, much consequences for the Arabs. He viewed Ayatollah Khomeini with utter contempt. Remember, Ayatollah Khomeini was really in exile and under kind of a house arrest of a sort in Iraq when Saddam was there. Iran, according to Saddam, was now being ruled by a bunch of nincompoop mullahs who didn't know anything about governance, and they were bickering among themselves. And this type of attitude that Saddam carried over regarding the Iranian Revolution, you will see will figure prominently in his decision a year later to actually invade Iraq. So, who was right? Was Assad correct in his interpretation, or Saddam? I think the answer, most experts would agree that Assad was correct. And if you have any doubt about it, ask Israelis to see what they think. All right, after about a year, Saddam's perception of threat from the West, and especially from the US and Israel, began to recede. Remember, that perception of threat was instantiated as a result of the Camp David agreement. With the declining threat perception, Saddam was no longer willing to accommodate with Hafez al-Assad of Syria and pursue the union with Syria. So, in order to get rid of that option, he comes up with some trumped-up charges against Syria, and these charges puts an end to any talk about union with Syria. And with that said, the enmity between the two leaders resumes in full force. Now, a major determinant of Arab politics from this point onward will be the rivalry between Saddam Hussein of Iraq and Hafez al-Assad of Syria, and they're both vying for the leadership of Arab nationalism. So this is a competition for Nasser's mantle, the leader of Arab nationalism. By this time, of course, Nasser is dead. Their rivalry actually becomes the primary cause of division in the Arab world, which already had suffered the loss of Egypt after the Camp David Accord. So the resumption of this rivalry marks a very important point. At that point, Saddam decides that he needs to shift his alliance away from the rejectionist front. The rejectionist fronts were really headed by Iraq and Syria, and their supporter, their superpower supporter, was the Soviet Union. And so Saddam decides to move away from the rejectionist front and instead to join the conservative, or at least get closer to the conservative pro-West regime in the region.